On today's episode of Locked On Wild, what can we expect in Brock Faber's sophomore season? How much time do you have?
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we will take a look at what to expect from Brock Faber for the 2024-2025 season. We'll take a look at his numbers before and after injury. We'll take a look at the numbers with various Wild defensemen to see why Faber's defensive numbers should improve with Jonas Brodin back as his pairing partner. And we'll take a look at the spots that we should expect to see Brock Faber throughout the season. My name is Seth Topal, your daily Minnesota Wild insider, credentialed Wild media member, and host of Locked On Wild since 2021. And this is going to be one of the ones that is exciting to do, these player previews, because it's a guy that a lot of us are really excited to see what he has in store for an encore. That, of course, is Mr. Brock Faber, who should probably have won the Calder Trophy. Connor Bedard ended up taking that because it was pretty much handed to him before the season started. But all told, Faber's rookie season was tremendously successful. He played in all 82 games, one of just 2 players on the Minnesota Wild roster to accomplish that last season, despite playing the final couple months of the season with broken ribs. He had 8 goals, 39 assists, 47 total points on the season. He also contributed 16 power play points, had 136 total shots on net, shot 5.9%, played just under 25 minutes per night, 24:58 to be exact. 150 blocked shots, 65 hits, 15 takeaways, 35 giveaways. Just a tremendous season for Brock Faber, and it resulted in all rookie team, runner-up in the Calder, and a guy who just looks primed to become a critical part of this Minnesota Wild team, not only on ice from a production standpoint, but also from a leadership standpoint as well. Faber just looks the part of a 10-plus year vet out there for the Minnesota Wild. And just looking at some of the other numbers for Faber that impressed me this past season, his Corsi numbers, and let's keep this in mind when I talk about these Corsi numbers, because your primary job as a defenseman is to stop the other team from scoring, which means that sometimes you're going to be stuck in your own end of the ice more often than, say, offensive players. And so Brock Faber coming in with a 47.8 Corsi for percentage for a defenseman is pretty good. If you're right around 50% as a defenseman, that's where you want to be. Now, from a point shares perspective, that's another stat that I like using to determine performance for various Minnesota Wild players. Brock Faber was at 7 point shares for the season. And again, point shares are the individual points that a particular player is responsible for by themselves. So Brock Faber by himself was responsible for 7 points in the standings, 2.8 offensively, 4.2 defensively, for a grand total of 7. Where does that rank on the Minnesota Wild roster? Well, if you look at such players as Kirill Kaprizov, who leads the way, Brock Faber was 4th on the team behind Matt Boldy, and Joel Eriksson Ek and Kirill Kaprizov. From a defensive standpoint, Faber was second on the team to Jonas Brodin. So Faber played a massive impact on the Wild roster. He was second on the team in blocks behind Jake Middleton and ahead of Jonas Brodin. The 47 points that he scored is pretty high up on the Wild rookie leaderboard as well for defensemen, and even just for defensemen overall. Really, every way you slice it up, it was a very impressive season for Faber, and that's even taking into effect what we learned after the season was done, that Faber played the final 2 months of the season with broken ribs. Now, if you know anything about broken ribs, and personally I do not, but everything that I've heard is it's incredibly painful. And just imagine having to try to do really anything out on the ice while you have ribs that are not only broken but tender every time they get hit. Faber's numbers through January 31st. And if we go with the final 2 months of the season, it happened sometime in the month of February to the end of the season. So we just went January 31st just to keep it simple. Faber had 4 goals, 25 assists, 29 total points in 49 games. He was a +4 at that point. And then from February 1st to the end of the season, Faber had 4 goals, 14 assists, 18 total points in 33 games, but he was a -5 in those final 33 games. So pretty substantial split between the two as far as his performance pre-injury and post. And I know that was mentioned by a lot of the analytical side of hockey, that it seemed like he was maybe starting to hit a rookie wall. In fact, I remember talking about that on this show. It was injury. There was no rookie wall, or it was an injury that led to his performance curtailing down the stretch. Now, some of the other numbers for Brock Faber from the season, I like to take a peek at what Money Puck has to say about various metrics on the team. We're going to dive into pairings quite a bit here in today's show, because there are a few that there's really interesting splits between Jake Middleton and Brock Faber and Jonas Brodin and Brock Faber. All told, for Brock Faber, 2,047 minutes played, which was at one point 4th most amongst all NHL players this past season. He led the Minnesota Wild. Actually, I beg your pardon. He was 8th on the team with 4.39 blocks per 60 minutes. And if you look at some of the defensive metrics, expected goals against, with Brock Faber on the ice just by himself, the Minnesota Wild outscored their opponents 10-3, and he had an expected goals against of 2.76 in all situations. Corsi for percentage by himself, 57.45%. So it's interesting there too, as we take a look at his Corsi percentage in all situations, a little lower, but his individual Corsi numbers much, much better, which you'd expect from a guy who, is more than capable of being able to step up in the play offensively. Now, looking at some of the other metrics, let's keep in mind as well that Faber was utilized as much as he was because of injuries to Jared Spurgeon, injuries to Jonas Brodin. Those two both missed large chunks of the season. Brodin missed 20 games. Spurgeon played in 16 total. And I think the most impressive part was that Faber was everything that the Wild had him do, whether it be stepping up and running a power play for the first time. He accepted the challenge in stride, and he excelled at every single thing that the Minnesota Wild asked him to do. in terms of time on ice. Faber averaged 2 minutes, 33 seconds on the power play. That was the third highest amongst Minnesota Wild defensemen. And Kalen Addison is counted because he did technically play with the Minnesota Wilds this past season. So he was at 4 minutes and 11 seconds. So you take him out of the mix, and the only defenseman who had more time on ice on the power play was Jared Spurgeon, which is where Brock Faber got the opportunity when Spurgeon got injured, that he was able to step in and take that spot. On the penalty kill, Faber third most behind Jared Spurgeon and Jonas Brodin, and a huge integral part of that penalty kill unit as well. I would expect that he is going to be in a similar position there this year as well. So there's a lot of really good things that Brock Faber did this past season, but the thing that sets Faber apart the most, I think, is he is able to digest opportunities and challenges very quickly. We talk about all the power play stuff. He wasn't as much of a play mover offensively in college, and he really has picked up quickly on that. And so it leads you to this player that there's just a really high ceiling on because of all the things that were thrown at him. He didn't fail in any aspect. And so there's a lot of confidence that he's going to be able to just continue to add to his repertoire, going to continue to hone his defense, going to add to his offensive skill set. And that's where you get a guy who is, a premier two-way defenseman and a player that's going to be talked about quite a bit here in the league over the next few seasons. So a great rookie season for Brock Faber, and there's no reason to expect that he won't be able to do everything that he did this past year and then some, depending on how things play out. We are going to take a look at ideal fit for Brock Faber. We'll take a look at the two most common pairings he was on this past season and why there should be some big optimism for his defensive numbers to be even better than they were this past season. We'll take a look at all that as we continue today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, have we got something different for you? Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with the YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. There's no shortage of opportunities for bets as well. The NFL back underway, college football back as well, and Major League Baseball is pushing towards the playoffs. So plenty of opportunities. Just go find whoever the Chicago White Sox are playing, throw $5 down on their opponent, and you're all set. You can take advantage of this great trial run with NFL Sunday Ticket. Just visit FanDuel.com to download America's #1 sportsbook. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. For your second listen, make sure to check out the Locked on NHL podcast as we take a look at some burning questions for every team in the West. Colorado, Dallas, and Edmonton on tap for today's show. So make sure to check out Locked on NHL. Once again, your team each and every day, part of the Locked on Podcast Network. So talking about ideal fits for the Minnesota Wild, for Brock Faber, well, it's pretty safe to say that Brock Faber is going to factor in heavily on defense, heavily on special teams, both power play and on the penalty kill. I found this interesting in looking at the numbers for his two most predominant line mates this past season. Obviously, the plan A is Brock Faber and Jonas Brodin. And those two combined for 556 minutes, 16 seconds this past season. Brock Faber played with Jake Middleton for 797 minutes, 51 seconds this past season. Obviously, that was because Brodin was out of the lineup. Here are the numbers for Faber and Middleton. The Corsi 4 percentage for the two of them was 45.16. So, again, you're dipping down into the mid-40s. Defensively, it could be higher. You'd want it to be higher, but it's not terrible for defensemen. But the key number here is that Faber and Middleton were outscored on the ice 38-28 as a defensive pairing. And they held serve in all the metrics, like high danger Corsi 4 was 133 to 126 in favor of Faber and Middleton. High danger goals were dead even. But, you look at it, and 17 high danger goals allowed by the two of them is a bit on the high side. If we look at Money Puck, Faber and Middleton this past season, they had a combined expected goals against per 60 minutes. And there really wasn't a huge difference between Middleton Faber and Brodin Faber in this aspect, but there was a difference. Middleton and Faber had an expected goals against per 60 minutes of 2.37. Think about 2.37 as a defensive pair. That really is pretty good. And honestly, you look at all of the expected goals against for the defensive pairings, large amounts of them. Now, the sample size is, there's not a ton of sample size for a bunch of these different pairings. But if we go to the pairings that played at least 100 minutes this past season, there were 9 of them that did. And Middleton Spurgeon had the lowest expected goals against per 60 minutes at 1.81. Declan Chisholm and John Merrill was actually next at 1.9 in 161 minutes. Your big pairings that we saw for large stretches of the season were Faber and Middleton. That was at 2.37, which was one of the highest, but again, highest at 2.37 really isn't that bad. Brodin and Brock Faber together in 562 minutes, 2.31. So again, not a huge sample size, not a huge difference, just 0.06. But over the course of the season, that is a handful of goals. And that ranked 4th best on the team. The others, Jonas Brodin and Zach Bogosian was at 1.97. And Goligoski and Bogosian was at 2.39. Middleton and Dakota Mermis was at 2.65. The worst pairing, for probably obvious reasons, was Damon Hunt and the now departed Kalen Addison, and that was at like 6.65. But we know Kalen Addison didn't play a ton of defense really ever. So back to the Brodin and Faber numbers. So for Faber and Brodin in 62 games. So we talked about Middleton and Faber got outscored by 10 goals, 38-28. Brodin and Faber were +3 in the goals department at 26-4, 23 against. Their Corsi 4 numbers were 4 percentage points better at 49.39. So it's a smaller sample size, but Brodin and Faber was the better pairing of the two. And so even though Brock Faber's numbers defensively really not that bad at all, we should expect that they will improve this season because the Brodin and Faber pairing was better than Middleton and Faber. And again, Jake Middleton and Jared Spurgeon, we look at the numbers that those two put together. Their Corsi for percentage was 53.42. Their goals for and goals against, they were +3 at 8-5. And so that pairing as well, and a sizable advantage in the high danger areas for Spurgeon and Middleton too. So a big key, and we'll probably do one of these types of shows before the season starts as well, is which areas for the Wild could actually be better this year. And it's apparent to me by looking at all these numbers that the defense was pretty good. The defense was pretty good last year, despite all the injuries. So we'll talk about the goaltending here as well before the season starts. But defensively, if you get back to Spurgeon, Middleton, Brodin, Faber, that's a fine top four. That's a fine top four. And then Chisholm and Bogosian on the back end. That's a serviceable third pair compared to what the Wild have had. And so Brock Faber's role in that factors in very heavy. He's going to get a ton of minutes defensively. Although his minutes will probably decrease if you have Spurgeon and Middleton and Brodin all healthy and you're able to roll with those two pairings predominantly. He should have a similar amount of minutes this year, but may have a slight bump there, or a slight decrease there. He's going to be, at minimum, the number 2 power play quarterback, depending on how that whole situation plays out. Me personally, I would like to see Faber get the opportunity. I know he got bumped off that group at the end of the season last year, but I think that had a lot to do with his injury. And honestly, Declan Chisholm did a good job there too. So whether it be Chisholm or Faber on that top power play, going to factor in heavily there. And then on the penalty kill, it's going to be Brodin, it's going to be Spurgeon, it's going to be Faber, it's going to be Middleton as your primary penalty killers defensively. And so Brock Faber, as far as his ideal role, is just doing all the things that he did this past season, just with the hope that there's a little help in all of the areas so that he doesn't have to necessarily do everything himself. Now, as far as expectations for this upcoming season go, we'll take a look at where he's projected so we can get a little sense as to what we can expect from Brock Faber for the 2024-2025 season. That is on the way as we finish today's episode of Locked On Wilds after this. One final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Reminder, we've got another episode coming for you later today. Alexis Pearson will join us for some PWHL coverage as we take a look at the new name for PWHL Minnesota, the Minnesota Frost. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about their new GM as well. So stay tuned. Coming up later this afternoon, Alexis Pearson joins us for some elite PWHL coverage. So let's look at expectations for Brock Faber for the upcoming season. Faber did a lot of really good things this past year. What could he do for an encore this upcoming season? And I'll start with the fantasy projection for Faber for the upcoming year from an offensive perspective. And ESPN loves Brock Faber from the looks of it. They're projecting Faber to have 11 goals, 48 assists, 59 total points, and 24 power play points, and he's going to play right around 25 minutes for the Wilds per night this season. So let's break this all down. A jump in goals from 8 to 11 projected. That is, I think, pretty realistic because, as mentioned, you look at those splits from the end of January to the end of the season. Faber's offensive numbers dipped. He went from shooting, now his shooting percentage wasn't great for the whole season, 5.2 through the end of January. It actually did increase a little bit to 6.8 from February 1st to the end of the season. But, Faber is a player who is still figuring out his shot, figuring out the offensive side of his game. And so if that increases and that continues to head in an upward trajectory, double-digit goals, I think, is pretty easily attainable for Faber. And an increase in power play points, too, from 16 to 24. Now that he's comfortable in one of those power play points, quarterback points, I don't see any reason why he can't have a surge in power play scoring. The splits between the first power play and the second are pretty jarring for this Minnesota Wild team, but the top power play unit has been pretty good at getting the puck in the net when they have those opportunities. And with the players that are on that unit and the options now that the Wild have to kind of fill in that second unit and create a little more balance, I see no reason to expect that power play can't continue to be as good as it has over the last few years, which means there are going to be plenty of opportunities for the Wilds, for players in particular, to score on those units. I think just by having Jonas Brodin back as his primary defensive partner is also going to make a big difference because Faber is going to be able to do a lot of the offensive driving on that group. Jonas Brodin is capable of scoring for sure, but he is definitely more of a defensive defenseman. And so he can focus on more of the defensive responsibilities, which can free Faber up to step into the play as needed. Here's what ESPN says about Faber's fantasy outlook as well. Faber was a lifesaver for the Wild a season ago as the 21-year-old took on a massive role for the club, posting 8 goals and 47 points in 82 games, while averaging 24.58 of on-ice time per game, 6th most in the entire league. Faber was recognized for his excellent freshman year as he was named a finalist for the Calder Trophy for NHL Rookie of the Year, an award won by Chicago's Connor Bedard. Toss in Faber's 16 power play points, 136 shots on goal, 65 hits, and 150 blocked shots, and you have a high-end all-around production. Given how young he is, it's reasonable to expect Faber to take another step forward this coming season, making him a player to target in all fantasy formats. And the other thing, too, that I think prevents Faber from having any sort of like a sophomore slump is he's fearless. Faber is fearless as a player out on the ice. He is not going to back down from any sort of a challenge. He put his physical well-being on the line for this Minnesota Wild team time and time again last season. And he does it without even a second's thought, which is why we didn't find out until after the season that he was playing with broken ribs, because he just did not want to make it about himself as opposed to doing what was necessary for the team. So he puts the team above himself, which is why I think any instance in which the Wild give him something to help the team win in terms of an opportunity or a role, he's not going to shy away from it. And so I feel really confident that Matt Boldy could have the type of season that ESPN is looking for, because outside of Brock Faber and Jake Middleton last year, the Wild did not get anything from their defensemen from a scoring standpoint last year. And so there are plenty of opportunities for defensive scoring for this Minnesota Wild team. And Faber can vault right to the top of the list amongst Wild players on defense. So in setting the over-under for Brock Faber this season, I'm going to do this with every player, is just try to set one. We're not going to do where we go through and do over-unders for every single statistical measure for every player. We're just going to try to set one for each player this year and see how we do at the end of the season. And the over-under that I'm setting for Brock Faber this year is 10 goals, because I think he has a great chance to hit double-digit goals this year with the power play responsibilities and just with his offense in general. And that's why I think he is primed for another fantastic season. And if you're looking for players to focus on this season, to kind of, if you're not bullish on the Minnesota Wild and their chances this year to compete in the Central, Brock Faber's one of the players that you should be keeping an eye on a nightly basis, because of the number of times he does things that don't even factor into the scoring. They're just what we like to call winning plays. And winning plays can be anything that impacts the outcome of the game. Brock Faber just makes a handful of them on a nightly basis. And so if you're looking for players to keep an eye on this year from a Minnesota Wild perspective, Brock Faber's definitely one of them, which is why I'm super, super high on his prospects this season to be really good offensively, to be better defensively than he was, and to just continue to be one of the young leaders of this team in both his play on the ice and his actions off it. So expecting a great season for Brock Faber. Let us know what you think about the over-under of double-digit goals for Brock Faber this season. Let us know in the comments, and we'll see where we end up. But that is going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Reminder, we got a second episode coming for you today, as we'll be talking with Alexis Pearson, talking about the new PWHL Minnesota name, the Minnesota Frost. So make sure to tune in for that coming up this afternoon. And make sure to subscribe to Locked On Wild so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. We've got new episodes for you every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.